Imagine for a brief moment that everything you were taught about the structure of divine reality is incomplete, or even worse, inverted. Have you ever felt while reading the scriptures a silent vertigo, a kind of cognitive dissonance that makes your stomach churn when you try to reconcile two images that are impossible to overlap? On one side, you visualize the Jesus of the Gospels, the one who prevents the stoning of the adulterous woman, who preaches love for enemies, and who offers the other cheek in the face of brutal violence. On the other side, on the same sacred pages, a tempestuous entity emerges, a God who orders the extermination of entire nations, who demands the blood of animals in meticulous rituals, and who calls himself jealous and vengeful. This feeling of strangeness is not a lack of faith, nor is it a defect in your spiritual understanding. In fact, this discomfort is the first symptom that your soul has perceived a flaw in the theological matrix, a crack in the veil that covers the greatest secret in the history of religions. We are about to enter a dangerous and fascinating territory where infantile certainties are left behind in favor of a truth that can be liberating or terrifying, depending on how attached you are to the traditions you inherited without questioning. The proposal that hangs in the air, whispered by Gnostics, heretics, and truth seekers for 2,000 years, is that the Father to whom Jesus referred with such intimacy and sweetness is not and never was the Jehovah of the armies of the Old Testament. The theory is shocking and visceral. The God who molded the clay, who regretted having created man, and who drowned the world in the flood would in fact be the Demiurge, a lesser craftsman, an architect of a flawed material world, an entity that demands worship and blind obedience because it does not possess the fullness of the true light. If this is true, Jesus would be an emissary of the ineffable God, the true and unknown Father, descending to this dense reality to rescue us from the prison of matter and the law of retaliation. It seems to make perfect emotional and logical sense when we compare the morality of Jesus with the brutality of the wars of Canaan. The piece seems to fit perfectly into the puzzle, resolving the biblical schizophrenia once and for all. But as soon as you start to feel comfortable with this revolutionary idea, a monumental obstacle arises, a wall that seems insurmountable and that threatens to tear down this entire Gnostic building we have just constructed. The question that echoes in the corridors of theology and that skeptics throw like a sharp spear against this theory is simple, direct, and devastating. If the God of the Old Testament is the Demiurge, an inferior or even malevolent being, and if Jesus came to reveal a totally different and superior Father, why does the Nazarene quote the ancient scriptures repeatedly? Why, at crucial moments of his mission, when life and death were at stake, does Jesus resort to the Psalms, the prophets, and the law of Moses? If he came to annul that system, why does he seem to validate it by saying that not one iota of the law would pass? We see Jesus in the desert, hungry and tempted by the devil, and his defense is not a new cosmic revelation, but direct quotes from Deuteronomy. We see him on the cross at the height of his agony, crying out the words of Psalm 22. If Yaldabaoth was the jailer of humanity, why would the liberator use the jailer's words as a source of authority and power? This is the contradiction that makes many seekers retreat, returning to the safety of traditional dogma, believing that Gnosis is just a conspiracy fantasy without a textual basis. However, I need you to hold on to this doubt and not let it paralyze your mind now, because it is exactly at this point of tension that the true magic of understanding happens. What seems to be a fatal contradiction may, in reality, be the master key to understanding the most sophisticated strategy ever executed in the history of the cosmos. Looking at Jesus' quotes only as a blind validation of the past is a superficial reading that ignores the depth of the Christic mission. What if the quotes were not a submission, but a subversion? What if Jesus were operating as an infiltrator in hostile territory, using the codes of the current system to implode it from within, redefining every word, every prophecy, and every law to point to a reality that the original authors of those texts could not even conceive. We are facing a mystery that requires us to stop reading the Bible as a flat instruction manual and start reading it as a multidimensional battlefield, where every phrase spoken by the Messiah carries layers of hidden meaning intended to awaken those who have ears to hear. In this journey that we begin now, we are going to dissect each of these moments. We will not run away from the difficult question. We will dive into it until we touch the bottom of the abyss. We will analyze why Jesus invokes the name of the God of Israel, how he manipulates the law to reveal the love that transcends the law, and most importantly, how he separates the wheat from the chaff within the Hebrew scriptures themselves. You will discover that Jesus was not confused, nor was he endorsing ancient barbarism. He was performing high-precision spiritual surgery, separating the light imprisoned in the letters of the law from the darkness that surrounded it. Prepare yourself, because what we are going to reveal in the next blocks will forever change the way you read the New Testament. The idea that Jesus served the Demiurge will fall to the ground, but not in the way fundamentalists expect. The truth is much more complex and infinitely more beautiful. If you have always felt that there was something more, something unsaid in Sunday sermons, this is your chance to see the veil tear. The question is not just why he quoted, but how he quoted and what he changed in doing so. Welcome to the true code of redemption. To understand the magnitude of Christ's mission, we must first have the courage to look at the setting where this battle was fought, for the stage is not what it seems and the curtains were sewn to hide the backstage. Imagine for a moment that the story you were taught, that linear and polished version about the perfect continuity between the Old and New Testaments, is just the surface of a much deeper and sometimes terrifying ocean. During the first centuries of Christianity, before the Roman Empire standardized the faith with the sword and dogma in political councils, there were groups that possessed a completely different view of reality. They were hunted, their books burned, and their teachings buried in the sands of Egypt for almost 2,000 years until they were rediscovered in Nag Hammadi. What did these original Christians know that was so dangerous that they had to be silenced? They knew that this material world is not the perfect creation of the Supreme Father, but a flawed copy, a dense and heavy simulation, generated by an inferior entity. In mystery traditions, this entity receives many names, the most common being the Demiurge, often identified as Yaldabaoth or Samael, the blind god. Unlike the ineffable Father, who is pure light, love, and spirit, the Demiurge is described as a figure of ignorance and arrogance, a craftsman who, without knowing the superior realm, molded chaotic matter and declared himself to be the only existing God. It is here that the architecture of control reveals itself with startling clarity. If you read the Old Testament without the lenses of religious conditioning, you will find a being who admits to being jealous, who regrets, who orders wars, who demands the foreskins of enemies and the smell of burning fat in animal sacrifices. A being who says he creates both light and darkness, both peace and evil. For the Gnostics, these were not characteristics of the Heavenly Father that Jesus came to reveal, but the psychological signature of the Archons. The Archons are described as the rulers of this world, the cosmic forces that manage the material prison and keep human souls trapped in an endless cycle of reincarnation, suffering, and forgetting. The architecture of this control is not just physical, it is legalistic and textual. The Old Testament, under this secret perspective, is not a prelude to love, but the penal code of the prison. The Mosaic Law, with its hundreds of rules impossible to fulfill, was not designed to free the human spirit, but to keep it busy, guilty, and fearful. Each rule, each sacrifice, and each commandment served as a binding contract, tying human consciousness to matter and the capricious will of the Demiurge. The Archons feed on this energy of servile devotion, the fear of punishment, and blind obedience. They built a moral labyrinth where escape was impossible. because the very structure of the law demanded a perfection that the flesh, created by them, could not achieve. It was a closed system, a rigged game where the house always won and the human soul always lost, returning to the dust to be recycled into more suffering. It is fundamental to understand this to answer the central question about Jesus' quotes. If the system was a perfect trap, how could someone enter it to deactivate it without setting off the alarms? Here lies the hidden secret that most theologians ignore. Jesus did not come as a reformer of the Demiurge's system. He came as an infiltrator from a superior reality, a divine intruder in enemy territory. To operate within the matrix, to use a modern term, he needed to interact with the matrix code. If Jesus had arrived and openly rejected every word of the ancient scriptures from day one, he would have been instantly eliminated as a lunatic or a demon, and his message would not have found any anchorage in the minds of the people of that time who were deeply programmed by the Torah culture. More than that, the strategy was metaphysical. To free the prisoners who signed a blood contract with the Demiurge, the Savior needed to deal with the clauses of that contract. He did not quote the Old Testament to validate it as the final truth, but to use it as a weapon against the very rulers of this world. Imagine a brilliant lawyer who enters a corrupt courtroom. He knows the judge is unjust and that the laws were made to oppress, but he doesn't go in screaming that the court is fake. Instead, he uses the court's own laws, the judge's own precedents and statutes to corner him, to find the legal loopholes and annul the contracts of slavery. Jesus quoted the scriptures not because they were the voice of his Father, but because they were the recognized authority on that plane of existence, and he needed to subvert that authority from the inside out. He was, in essence, hacking the operating system of archontic reality, using the very programming language that the Demiurge installed. By saying, "It is written," he was not paying homage. He was summoning the rules of the game to then transcend them with a new commandment, a new covenant that did not depend on fear or blood. This vision changes everything. We stop seeing Jesus as a continuer of a tribal religion and start seeing him as a cosmic liberator who descended into the abyss to rescue the sparks of light imprisoned in matter. He knew the Archons, knew who the prince of this world was, and understood that the battle was not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the heavenly realms. The use of ancient scriptures was a tactic of spiritual guerrilla warfare. He took the prophecies that the Demiurge intended for a warrior and political messiah and reconfigured them to reveal a kingdom that is not of this world. He used the image of the suffering servant to break the wheel of karma and retribution. Therefore, when we see Jesus opening the scrolls of Isaiah or quoting the Psalms, we are not seeing a submission to the God of the Old Testament, but the beginning of a calculated dismantling. He was about to perform the greatest act of divine sabotage in history, transforming the symbols of oppression into keys of liberation. And to do so, he needed to speak the language of the jailers before opening the cells. But to understand this infiltration at a level that transcends mere theology or linguistic strategy, we need to dive into what modern science is only beginning to scratch, but which the ancient Gnostic masters already knew intuitively: the physics of vibration and the biology of spiritual ascension. Everything that exists in the universe, from the most distant star to the smallest cell in your body, is fundamentally composed of energy vibrating at specific frequencies. When Jesus quoted the ancient scriptures, he was not just reciting legal or historical texts. He was operating an advanced sonic technology, using the law of resonance to alter the structure of reality around him. Think of the Old Testament and the Mosaic Law not just as a book, but as a programming code, a very specific wave frequency that kept humanity trapped in a limited state of consciousness, focused on survival, fear, guilt, and blind obedience. This frequency, which we could call the Demiurge's hertz, is dense, heavy, and designed to keep the human spirit chained to matter in an endless cycle of action and reaction, or what the East calls karma. By quoting these passages, Jesus was doing something similar to what an opera singer does when they find the exact note of a crystal glass. He does not sing the note to join the crystal, but to enter into resonance with it, vibrating at the same structural frequency until the point of saturation, where the rigid structure can no longer support the energy and shatters. Jesus needed to quote the law to tune the collective mind of his listeners, which was vibrating at this frequency of fear and submission. If he had arrived speaking only in a language of pure unconditional love and quantum freedom, the cognitive dissonance would be so great that no one would hear him. It would be like trying to tune an FM radio on a shortwave device. He needed to find the frequency of the prison to be able to break it from the inside out. Every time he said, "You have heard what was said to the ancients," he was establishing the connection with the old code, the old mental software implanted by the Demiurge. But immediately after, by saying, "I, however, say to you," he introduced a new frequency, a higher octave that rewrote the previous code, transmuting the law of retaliation into the law of love and revenge into forgiveness. This is not just philosophy, it is applied quantum biology. We know today that our DNA is not just a chemical storehouse of data, but an oscillating antenna capable of sending and receiving information through electromagnetic fields. Fear, anger, and guilt, emotions perpetuated by the Old Testament control system, cause a contraction in our energy field and literally deactivates certain genetic markers, keeping us in an animal survival mode. What Jesus brought was a frequency of expansion. By using known words but charged with a new vibrational intention, he was hacking the nervous system of his followers. He used the jailer's symbols to unlock the chemical doors within the human brain, stimulating the pineal gland and activating what scientists call junk DNA, which is actually the dormant divine potential, our heritage of light that was suppressed by the Demiurge's genetic engineering. The citation of the scriptures was the Trojan horse. The payload was the activation of Christ consciousness. Consider reality as a vast ocean of waves. The God of the Old Testament operated through low-frequency waves, creating a solid, immutable, and punitive reality. Jesus, by quoting these texts, entered this wave field but applied the principle of destructive and constructive interference. In physics, when two waves meet, they can cancel each other out or amplify each other. Jesus used the wave of the ancient law and launched against it the wave of grace. Where the law said eye for an eye, creating a cycle of pain, Jesus superimposed the frequency of offer the other cheek. This was not passivity, it was a noise-cancelling technique. He was neutralizing the Demiurge's wave of violence with a counter wave of absolute peace, creating a 0 point, a quantum silence where the true God, the ineffable and purely spiritual Father, could finally be heard within the temple of the human body. He did not come to validate the prison of flesh and the iron law. He came to demonstrate that matter is malleable before the spirit. Therefore, the quotes were not a submission to Jehovah's authority, but a demonstration of mastery over the illusion he created. Jesus was teaching the alchemy of the word. He showed that you do not need to flee the world or physically destroy the book of the law. You need to transmute the meaning, elevate the vibration of the dead letter until it becomes life-giving spirit. He was showing us how to navigate the matrix without being consumed by it. By aligning his speech with the prophecies, he was using the system's own algorithms to validate his presence as the system administrator, the one with root credentials to format humanity's hard drive. It is a matter of vibrational authority. The Demiurge shouts through thunder, wars, and commandments written in stone, dense and noisy forms. The true Father whispers through intuition, silence, and love, subtle frequencies that require a tuned receiver. Jesus quoted the thunder to capture attention, but delivered the whisper to free the soul. He knew that liberation could not be imposed from the outside, but had to be an internal phase shift, a cellular and atomic reorganization that would transform the human being from a creature of clay, fearing an angry God, into a being of light, aware of their kinship with the original source. And to start this biological and spiritual chain reaction, He needed the fuel that was already stored in people's minds, the very scriptures that imprisoned them. Now that you understand that Jesus used the scriptures not to validate the jailer, but to show the prisoners how to open the cells from the inside, we come to the crucial point of our journey. It is not enough to know this intellectually. You can memorize all the contradictions in the Bible. You can perfectly understand the theological difference between the jealous tribal God and the universal Father. But if you do not practice the extraction of this light, you will continue to be a prisoner who only understands how the lock works, but never turns the key. We now enter the territory most dangerous for the control system and the most liberating for you, the practice of awakening or active gnosis. The first step of this practice is what the ancient initiates called the revocation of consent. Understand that the Demiurge, or the material control system, operates through a tacit contract that requires your continuous agreement. It extracts this agreement through trauma, fear, and the imposition of a false identity as a sinner. Every time you feel guilt for simply existing, you are signing that contract again. Every time you fear a punitive God who demands sacrifices, you are validating his authority over your divine spark. To break this, you need a moment of absolute sovereignty, just as Jesus had in the desert when he rejected the offers of power over the material kingdoms. The practice begins with silence, but not a passive silence. Jesus instructed his followers to enter their room and close the door to pray to the Father in secret. This was not just an instruction about privacy, it was a metaphysical technique of sensory isolation. The room is your mind, and closing the door is blocking the noises and frequencies of fear that the world, the Demiurge's domain, constantly bombards you with. When Jesus quoted the Old Testament, he was rewriting the code in real time, and you must do the same through creative visualization. Close your eyes now and imagine all the definitions that the world has imposed on you. See the labels of guilty, inadequate, fearful, or servant as dark chains trying to attach themselves to your light body. The breach of contract happens when you declare with all the strength of your intention that you no longer accept the authority of any being or system that demands your submission through fear. Say internally that you revoke any permission given, consciously or unconsciously, for your energy to be drained by feelings of unworthiness. Feel these chains dissolving not by force but by the simple memory of who you are. This leads us to the second fundamental exercise: direct connection with the source without intermediaries. The religious system created by the Demiurge loves intermediaries: priests, pastors, complex rituals, and above all, the idea that God is distant, on a throne, judging you. Jesus came to implode this distance. When he said, "The kingdom of God is within you," he was giving you the geographic coordinates of freedom. The practice here is the interiorization of divinity. Instead of projecting your prayer outward to the physical sky or to a mental image of a bearded old man, direct your attention to the center of your chest, to the core of your consciousness. Visualize a golden, inextinguishable flame that was not created but has always existed. This is your direct heritage from the True Father. By focusing on this inner light, you begin to vibrate at a frequency that the Demiurge's system cannot hack. It is as if you become invisible to the low vibrations of control, guilt, and fear. It is in this state of internal connection that true alchemy happens. Remember how Jesus transformed the ancient laws, where it was written, "Eye for an eye." He transmuted it to love your enemies. In your daily practice, you must perform this same transmutation. When a thought of scarcity or fear arises, coming from the old programming of your reptilian brain, do not fight it. Instead, recognize it as a quote from the Old Testament of your mind, an ancient law that no longer serves, and immediately superimpose on it the new law of love and abundance of the True Father. If life presents you with a conflict situation, instead of reacting with the aggressiveness of the God of war, respond with the serenity of the internal Christ. This is rewriting reality. This is using the raw material of the world, which is dense and often cruel, as fuel to generate light. You are not fleeing reality. You are, as Jesus did, using the elements of this world to build a bridge out of it. This practice of active gnosis requires discipline. The system will try to pull you back into the drama, into political polarization, into the fear of the news, into the feeling that you are just a biological body fighting for survival. But each time you close the door of your internal room and reconnect with the source, you strengthen the signal of your true origin. You begin to realize that the ancient scriptures, with their wars and rigid laws, are records of a level of consciousness that you have already surpassed. You stop being a character in the Demiurge's game and start being a conscious programmer, rewriting your destiny. Jesus quoted the scriptures to show that he had authority over them, and not the other way around. By practicing this spiritual sovereignty, you take command. You stop asking for permission to exist and start emanating the life that flows from the true Father. And it is exactly this change of posture, from a frightened servant to a conscious son, that prepares us to understand the final goal of this entire mission, the great secret that was kept under 7 keys about the future of humanity and the destiny of your soul. This great secret lies in the understanding that the ancient law served as a severe tutor, a necessary guardian for an infantilized humanity that did not yet know how to discern the light without the threat of punishment, but which now, through Christ consciousness, is invited to graduate to a superior reality. By understanding that the soul's destiny is not eternal submission to arbitrary rules, but conscious reintegration with the primordial source, everything changes, and Jesus' strategy becomes crystal clear before our eyes. He did not quote the ancient scriptures as a seal of blind approval or a validation of the Demiurge's cruelty, but rather as a master who uses the prison's own regulations to find the release clause for the prisoners. Jesus knew the law better than the Pharisees and doctors because he saw the structure behind the dead letter, seeing the cracks through which the true light could enter. When he says that he did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, he is saying that he came to finalize the purpose of that ancient contract, ending the cycle of debt and guilt that the tribal god imposed on his followers. Fulfilling the law is ultimately transcending it, making it obsolete through the introduction of a superior principle, unconditional love that does not demand blood sacrifices, but the surrender of the heart. Therefore, every quote that Jesus made from the Old Testament was a surgical operation, a way of rescuing the sparks of truth that were imprisoned within a control system, separating the wheat from the chaff within the Jewish tradition itself. He needed to speak the language that the people understood, use the images they respected, to then subvert the meaning from the inside out and guide them to a new covenant. Imagine someone who enters a dark labyrinth to rescue lost people. This rescuer needs to know the paths of the labyrinth, needs to use the maps that are on the walls, not because he loves the labyrinth or its architect, but because it is the only way to lead the lost to the exit. Jesus used the Old Testament as this map, pointing to the prophecies, not to glorify the past, but to prove that the arrival of the kingdom of God was the end of that era of fear. He was dismantling the Demiurge's authority using the very rules that the Demiurge established, showing that true justice is not in the retaliation of an eye for an eye, but in the divine capacity to forgive and transcend matter. This brings us to the supreme call to freedom that echoes through the centuries until it reaches you now at this very moment. The hidden message behind this revolutionary theology is that you are not a servant created to fear a choleric God who hides in storm clouds, but rather a living fragment of the true Father, a divine spark that is momentarily wearing a biological body. The God of this world, the Demiurge, wants you to believe that you are small, a sinner, and dependent on human intermediaries and external laws to be saved. But the Christ, the emissary of the ineffable God, came to tell you that the kingdom is within you. This is the master key that opens all chains. Divinity is not something sought outside, in stone temples or in empty rituals, but is a frequency of consciousness accessed in the silence of your own being. By realizing this, you stop being a passive spectator of your spirituality and take command of your eternal destiny, breaking with the cycles of reincarnation and suffering that are fed by ignorance and fear. The true battle is not against flesh or blood, but against the limiting ideas that were implanted in your mind since birth. Ideas that say you must fear God instead of loving and knowing Him. Gnosis, or direct knowledge, is the tool that Jesus offered us to soar through the bars of this mental prison. When He quotes the Psalms on the cross, He is teaching us that even in the moment of greatest pain and apparent abandonment by the world's system, the connection with the true Father remains unshakable and is the only way of resurrection. You have the opportunity today to make this same choice, to continue living under the shadow of fear and guilt, trying to please an insatiable judge, or to accept the heritage of a son and awaken to the reality that you are free. Spiritual freedom is dangerous for the system, because those who have no fear cannot be controlled, and that is exactly why this vision was persecuted and hidden for so long. We have reached the end of this investigative journey, but this is only the beginning of your personal awakening. If something inside you vibrated upon hearing these words, if an ancient memory of your soul was activated as we confronted the difference between the God of the law and the Father of grace, then you are ready to go deeper. Do not let this flame go out with the distractions of daily life. Knowledge is a path of no return, and now that you have seen the gears behind the veil, you can no longer pretend you do not know. Your search for truth is what feeds this channel, and is what allows us to continue bringing content that challenges the status quo and expands consciousness. Therefore, I now make a direct invitation to your essence. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, not just to help the numbers, but to firm a commitment to your own evolution. Share this video with those you feel are also ready to wake up, for freedom is the only thing that multiplies when divided. Leave your comment below saying, "I am free to decree this new phase in your life." The truth has been told, the path has been pointed out, and the door is open. The decision to cross it, as always, is exclusively yours.